So good evening and welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series. My name is Alex Schaffner and I'm the events director here at the store. And on behalf of all of us here, I would like to offer a huge thank you to you for being here tonight, for supporting an amazing journalist and your local indie bookstore. We've been here since 1961, thanks to readers who buy our books and attend our events, and have supported us through the last few years when we've expanded massively in a time of great tumult. So thank you for being a part of our community and for being here tonight. Amy will be signing at the end of the Q&A tonight, so if you haven't bought a book and would like to, we do have them for sale at the back counter and you can find us there. If you pre-ordered a book, that's also where you'll pick it up. And if you'd like to meet Amy and have your book signed, or know her very, very well and want to say hello, you'll be lining up along this bookcase and the line will just head towards the back of the store, just to keep things organized. So thank you for that. Many, many thanks to tonight's moderator, Deborah Blum. Deborah, director of the Night Science Journalism Program at MIT and the publisher of Undark Magazine, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist, columnist, and author of 6 books, most recently, The Poison Squad, which was a 2018 New York Times notable book. It's a real honor to have her expertise and her presence here, so thank you so much for coordinating this conversation. Now I am pleased to present our guest author, Amy Dockser Marcus. Amy is a staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She won a Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting in 2005 for her series of stories about cancer survivors and the social, economic, and health challenges they faced living with the disease. Dockser Marcus is the author of The View from Nebo, How Archaeology is Rewriting the Bible and Reshaping the Middle East, and Jerusalem 1913, The Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. She has a Master of Bioethics degree from Harvard Medical School and lives here in Boston. In We the Scientists, Amy focuses on a small group of parents whose children share the most terrible thing in common, a rare disease under-researched and undertreated. These parents became advocates and citizen scientists, bringing focus and forward motion to a devastating thing in combination with some of the foremost scientists working today on this issue. We the Scientists explores how community and science can and should interact in order to serve us all. I'm thrilled to have Amy discuss the book here tonight, so please join me in welcoming author Amy Dockser Marcus.
That's a good answer. Hi, I'm Deborah. I'm really honored to be moderating this event, and I want to start very briefly by just telling Amy how much I like the book. The book's really a terrific, thoughtful, fascinating book, and one of the things that stood out for me in it, although you might not exactly see this coming, is the fact that it's a suspenseful book. And the suspense that runs through this book is a question: can we save these children? Right. And within that question, can we save them, is also a question of how science works, what partnerships are with science, how we build new bonds in making this work, how we fail to build those bonds. So what I'd like to start with, Amy, is just asking you, was there a particular inspiration for pursuing a story like this? Something, you can even be personal about it, something in your own life that made you think, I want to look at this issue?
Yeah, I think with a book like this, there always usually is a personal story at the heart of it. And my personal story was that my mother was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer, metastatic gallbladder cancer. And as I tried to help her by doing research and interviewing doctors and trying to figure out what would be the best treatment, I realized that actually there were no treatments. What the doctor was recommending was the same thing that doctors had been recommending for probably 40 years, the same drug. And all you had to do was read the papers to know that it was not going to be effective. I mean, we'd be lucky if we extended her life for a couple years, and she barely lived longer than that. And so, I was, of course, devastated. But beyond that, I felt angry. I felt upset. I was, a reporter, a health reporter. I'm really good at finding information. And I had a great Rolodex filled with the top doctors in the country who all took my calls and were very nice to me. and yet there wasn't anything going on. And so I started to think about that, like, you know, we live in Boston, great medical system, best doctors, like why is it so hard to develop a drug? Why isn't anything moving? I ended up applying for a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to investigate policy issues about rare disease drug development. And I was looking to try to find people who were doing something out of the box. And someone recommended to me a group of parents. They told me that these parents had children with a very rare disease, Niemann-Pick disease type C, a genetic disease, and that they too didn't have a drug, and that not only were they trying to find a better way to do things, they had these partners. They had doctors, they had scientists, they had some government, officials who wanted to try to do science in a different way and had embarked on an unusual partnership. And I ended up getting introduced to all of them, and they allowed me to follow their journey, which was really amazing because it was a very difficult thing for all of them.
So I actually want to go forward, but I want to stop you on the point about Niemann-Pick type C. Can you talk a little bit about these diseases and what makes them so rare? I had not even heard of this disease actually until I started following your work and looking at this book. So I think it'd be really helpful for if people haven't read the book to just get a little bit of sense of what we're talking about.
So, it is a very rare disease. At the time when I was doing my reporting, the doctors told me that they thought there were maybe only 200 cases in the United States, maybe 500 cases worldwide. Probably those numbers are higher because many people go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, but at the time that was the information I gave me. And even if it's undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, it's still not a lot of people. And it's one of around 50 plus diseases that fall under this umbrella called lysosomal storage diseases. And you're probably maybe more familiar with Tay-Sachs disease, which is one, or Gaucher disease, which is another. But they're rare in part because in order to get it, you have to have a parent who has a faulty gene, and you have to inherit a faulty gene from each parent. So, so what are the odds that carriers are going to meet each other, they're going to have kids, and then the child is going to inherit, both of the genes. But because it's so rare, it's just very, very challenging to develop drugs, to do studies, to run a clinical trial, to get the money to do all these things, and to convince people to enroll their children in a trial that you don't know if it's going to benefit them or not.
So we've got this incredibly rare disease and this small group of parents. What was it in this story? I mean, you're a health reporter. You've covered lots of diseases, and really, familiar diseases like cancer. What was it in this particular story that you said, I want to focus here, I want to follow these people, I want to see where this story takes me? What made it stand out for you?
Well, first of all, at the time my children were young also. I was, also a mother with young children, and so I think I was very sympathetic to what they were going through as a parent. I felt for them. The scientists, I want to say that two of the scientists in the book are here tonight. So, Chris Austin and Dan Ori, they're standing in the back. Two very amazing, compassionate, and brilliant men. And all of the scientists I met were like that. And many of the narratives that you read or the movies you see are often sort of, it's, us against the system. There's villains who are trying to stop us. But what I found in the story was that everybody was trying really hard. They didn't always agree with each other, and they didn't always have the same perspective on things. But every single person, all the parents I met, the families I met, all the scientists I met, they really wanted to do something to help each other. They really wanted to try to be a community, and I think they were ahead of their time. I think that they set a path that a lot of people can follow now and probably have an easier time than they had. It's not easy to be the pioneers when you're trying something new, but I think that's what I found so compelling about them, is that they wanted to try something different and work together and not be, us against them, or, it's more like, as the book says, we together, we the scientists, we the families, we the patients, and, we the people.
Right. Yes, that's an important phrase in our, in this country's history. I was debating whether to ask you to do this, but listening to you talk about this, and I want to get, as we move this conversation forward, I want to look at sort of two different threads that come up in the book. One is following the stories of the families. One is following the stories of the scientists, and you do this really well. I want to start with the families. And as I listened to you talk, it occurred to me that one way we might start that, interrupting my, brilliant line of questioning here, is to ask you to read just a little bit of that kind of sets the scene for you all if you haven't read the book yet. But gives you a sense first about the real power of Amy's storytelling in this book, which is remarkable, but also sort of lays out, I think, the framework of why this matters so much, and I actually
You chose something.
chose the start of this chapter.
Okay, really the start of the book.
Really
chapter
the
one.
start of the book.
Yeah. Addison and Cassidy Hempel, identical twin girls, were born on January 23rd, 2004. Their father liked to say that the girls had a birthday no one could forget. Born on 1-2-3-4, Hugh Hempel said. In the hospital, for the first 2 days after they were born, the nurses called the girls Baby A and Baby B. Hugh and Chris, the twins' mother, had picked out 3 potential names if the children turned out to be boys: Clayton, Carson, and Cole. The names rolled off their tongues, but they couldn't agree on what to call the children if they turned out to be girls. They decided they wanted to see their faces first, and then decide. The twins were supposed to be born at the Washoe, I hope I pronounced that right, Medical Center in downtown Reno, a short drive from the couple's home in a grassy enclave that boasted its own private golf course. But the evening Chris went into labor, the neonatal intensive care unit at the hospital was full with premature babies, so they got sent to another hospital a few miles away. By the time they arrived, it was 10 p.m. Chris had been in labor for hours. The hospital scrambled to get a team together and rushed Chris into surgery for a cesarean section. By 11:15, the girls were born, arriving a minute apart. They each weighed less than 5 pounds. Their eyes were dark blue that started to lighten as the days went on. They had clear skin, tiny button noses, and in notes Chris made in their baby book, inner ears shaped like hearts, along with mouths that reminded her of tiny rosebuds.
So this starts at this moment kind of normalcy, and what we all imagine things might start with, and you're going to see as you go forward the way the disease intrudes into their lives. So I want to have you talk a little bit about the families you chose, and I was wondering if you could particularly talk about one family, actually not this one, but the Hempel family. That is the Hempel family, that's right, why am I'm losing it here. The Hempel family and the question of their role in bringing up the idea of compassionate use.
Yeah, I mean, compassionate use is something that the FDA makes available for people who really have no other options available. They are probably going to die, they're not going to qualify for a clinical trial, they don't have any options. And if a doctor thinks that there's a therapy that might help them, they can go to the FDA and make a request to get access to a drug.
So, but this is not the first thing the Hempels do. They start out by actually having to figure out what's going on with their children, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why this is such a challenge is that, at the time, Dan helped develop a blood test that will make it easier to diagnose people with this disease. But again, at the time when this family and the other families were getting diagnosed, there were no blood tests. And so doctors, you'd have to do a skin punch, which is a very, invasive type of test. So if doctors suspected that you had a lysosomal storage disease, they first want to rule out everything else that they could do with a blood test. And sometimes NPC disease, which is the acronym for what the children had, sometimes they didn't look for that right away. It could take years of going doctor to doctor. And it took a while to get their diagnosis, but they were able to get a diagnosis.
So imagine that you're a parent, you have these 2 treasured children, they have a rare disease, and you're trying to figure out how to save them, right? And there's nothing really easily out there that can do that. At what point does a family say, and again, I think I want to use the Handbook as an example of this, the way the system is working for me is not enough to save my children. And so when I was sort of got ahead of myself with the question of compassionate use, but this is a really interesting story involving the idea that there might be some kind of drug or pharmaceutical compound that could help that is not easily available. And I think this is actually fairly typical in rare diseases, but also, as Amy mentioned with her mom, sometimes we have just not figured out, right, the right pharmaceutical compound that we can really use to make a difference. So these parents are on a quest. And let's call the whole part of this story is a quest. These parents are on a quest, the scientists are on a quest. Let's look at how the parents approach that quest here, and then let's move over into the field of science and the system of how science works.
Yeah. So, you know, the parents were looking for something that they could probably, you know, help advance into clinical trials. There had already been work done within the scientific community that identified a promising compound. There was already testing going on when the Hempels entered the scene. And this compound that seemed promising was a compound called cyclodextrin. And the scientists, there was some data in animal models that indicated that this might be good. And the scientists were starting to think about, if we wanted to construct a clinical trial, how would we do this? But it was very preliminary. They didn't know how to measure improvement if you gave this compound to children. They'd only done this in mice, and you can't exactly, you know, start slicing the brains of children up like you do to mice to see if there's improvement. So they were working towards a clinical trial. The Hempels identified, you know, this compound as well. The scientists seemed to be very interested in this. There were some papers that came out that really seemed to, you know, put this to the top of the list. And there were sort of two parallel tracks in these meetings between the families and the scientists. One, how could we gain data that we would be allowed to open up a formal clinical trial with the FDA, you know, weighing in, and we're heading towards a drug approval hopefully someday. And two, wow, for this generation of children, are they gonna be able to wait to get this? Are they gonna wanna wait for the, you know, a clinical trial to get up? Could they get access to this compound outside a trial? And, you know, that has consequences, that decision, because when you are trying to enroll patients in any kind of trial, there's not a lot of numbers to begin with, it's a rare disease. And then also, not everybody wants to enroll their child in a clinical trial. Like, everyone has a different sense of the risks and benefits, and not everyone wants to do that. It's very scary to put your child in a clinical trial. And it takes a long time to get all these permissions, and your child is progressively getting worse. You're not sure how long it's gonna take to open up a trial. You're not sure your child will qualify once the trial is open. So there's tension, there's inherent tension here between scientists who wanna do a formal clinical trial, some families who want access to it outside a formal clinical trial, and this tension becomes one of sort of central to the narrative. And it's central to how science gets done also.
Let me ask you this, and again, I'm sort of dropping back into a kind of personal point. And to do this, I'm going to briefly mention something personal from my own life. So my oldest son, who is now in his 30s, when he was in middle school, developed a syndrome, or that is not as rare as this, but relatively rare. It's called pseudotumor cerebri, or intracranial hypertension, in which the brain makes too much cerebrospinal fluid, and the symptoms mimic a brain tumor, which is why it's called pseudotumor cerebri. And in the course of finally figuring out what this was and then how to treat it, I'm a science journalist, and I found myself sometimes really pushing back on what I think of as the medical system, right? I mean, at a certain point when they were trying to discharge him from the hospital, I refused. And I'm like, and I just said to them, I had a doctor quoting clinical trials to me. And I said, well, clinical trials don't mean that much at the individual level, but I'm a science journalist, so I was comfortable saying that. And it felt like a giant weight pushing against me. So what I want to get back to then is, you went through this with your mom. You're a science and medical journalist, and there's a lot of power in that. Did these parents feel like they had any power going into the system? And I didn't feel that powerful, which is why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah.
I just was a journalist enough to be very stubborn about it. So.
Well, it's a really interesting question about power, right? I mean, because none of us have power. I mean, I've interviewed doctors who, when they're on the other side, when they get diagnosed with something, feel powerless too, because the system just crushes you. It's just so hard to navigate, and it's so challenging. You know, there's a rigidity to the system that seems deeply not humane when you're dealing with an individual case, and that can be very frustrating. This particular group of parents, though, I mean, and again, this is an issue what we have to think about also, which is privilege. All the parents in this sort of inner group, highly educated. Many of them had resources. You know, they had good jobs. They had money that they could spend, their own money that they could spend. They had social networks. They had tons of friends that they could call and ask advice for and get recommendations from. So I wouldn't call them powerless. I think that they had a great, you know, Chris Hempel, the mother of the twins, her job was, she was a PR person and a high level PR person, someone who did strategy. You know, she worked at Netscape, and she gave advice to Netscape in their battle with Microsoft. I mean, very sophisticated understanding of how to wield power. So I wouldn't call the parents powerless, but what I would call them is when you feel constrained by the system, by the framework of the system, and when you feel constrained by the framework of the system, there's an immense amount of frustration, you know, that you can't move. It's like, how do you move a system? It's just gigantic. So even if you find someone sympathetic, and the scientists they found were highly sympathetic, it still is incredibly frustrating, and you can just feel so upset some days, really.
So we look at the system for a minute. And was it a system, did they perceive the scientific system as being open to having parents be, I'm gonna say partners, or, you know, real, I mean, this is we the scientists,
Yeah.
right? Open, did they see the system itself as being open, and how did they approach that?
Well,
And how do you see the system?
yeah. So let me tell you first about how I see the system, and then I might ask Dan and Chris. Let's see, we can agree with how I see the system. One of the things that I find really frustrating about the system is that I think that there is language that Congress, when they set up the language for the FDA, gave the FDA flexibility. Flexibility to do certain things to reflect the people's will. And in my opinion, I think that there's a way that you can gather data, that it can help reinforce trial data. In fact, in many rare diseases, what you're seeing now is that a single trial that's done in the most rigorous fashion, often the FDA does not consider that sufficient enough, and yet there's not enough patients or money or time to run a second confirmatory trial. And so the FDA lately has been turning towards data that's collected in a rigorous manner outside a formal trial. Like, even the FDA is moving towards that now a little bit. But back when they were trying to set up their system, they didn't do that as much. And so I think the scientists' deepest worry, and here you can tell me if you disagree, but I felt the scientists' deepest worry was that if they, first of all, they were short-staffed, not a lot of power, you know, not enough bodies to do all this work. They had to get this trial going, very hard to do, not enough money, and they were worried that it would siphon off patients from a formal clinical trial, and that the data wouldn't be collected in a rigorous manner. Now, an ideal system would help them do that. An ideal system would enable them to get funding from the FDA and advice from the FDA to set up a sort of collection of information using the same sort of system you're collecting for the formal trial for people that didn't qualify, and people that wanted to take the risk, knowing that there might be no benefit and you might make your kid worse, and that data could supplement the formal trial. That's the system I want to see. That's, but I don't know. Did the two of you see the problem as, maybe you saw the problem differently than I did?
I think you're right. I think the issue was that we were constrained by what the rules and regulations are at the FDA. I agree that they are more open now to more innovative approaches, but back in 2014, 15, there was really no other option. And if we just opened up, so you can go to one end, one extreme. If you just opened up the expanded access, which is the compassionate use, to all the patients, they would eventually get the drug, but there would be no guarantee that that drug could continue to be produced. There would be no guarantees that they would continue to get the drug a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. The only way to do that was to actually get FDA drug approval. And the only way to get FDA drug approval is to do formal clinical trials that FDA wanted done. So you have this exact tension that existed between doing what is best for present patients, but maybe more for future patients versus for the individual. And what the parents envisioned was very visionary, and we tried to help with that, but it wasn't. We didn't feel in the end it was going to lead to a drug approval process that would be beneficial to all patients. And so it was a real, I would say it was a real tension that existed.
Yeah, and I would just add a couple things. The first is that Amy's absolutely right, and Dan and I have experienced this firsthand, that the system was set up to do certain things, but science has changed so much. Science has changed so much that system really doesn't work anymore. You can imagine trying to, if we all had, Windows 2000s on our computers. That's the kind of era that we're dealing with, and I at the time I was at NIH running an institute, the purpose of which was to innovate on the system. That's the purpose, and so this story fit perfectly into what my institute wanted to do, and actually there's lots of things that we could talk about, as you might imagine, because it's a very rich story, but when we first started thinking about this, I actually had a program hypothesis. That is, scientists always come up with hypotheses and then they want to test them, right? So my hypothesis was, in this drug development program, that if we included patients as members of the project team from the very beginning, which was heretical, that the drug development process would be faster, more efficient, more relevant to patients' needs. And I think in large part the answer to that was yes. There were more twists and turns than we ever could have imagined, but I think that's true, and it's good to see FDA responding in that way. But I can tell you, Dan and I had a meeting with them very early where we wanted to do exactly what Amy said, and they said, look, you want to get this thing approved, you will do a randomized controlled trial, or don't even come to us. And so we had the patient on one side, and the FDA on the other, and realized that Dan and I are both doctors. We want to help the patients right in front of us, but one of the conundrum of it we run into, and we really ran into this in this program, is that clinical trials traditionally are considered not to be for the benefit of the people in the trial. Yeah. That's how they're considered. They're supposed to be for future people, the children with NPC who haven't been born yet or haven't been diagnosed yet. And so this whole idea that we would develop a drug in the lifetime of these children for this disease was also heretical. And then the third radical one was that the drug, cyclodextrin, actually wasn't even a drug. It was an additive used to allow drugs to be soluble enough that you could inject them into people. And so the whole idea was different in a lot of ways. And I'd say one of the biggest tensions that we had was that the parents were doing the right thing as parents. Any of us who had children who were dying in front of their eyes every day, and literally that was the case, you would do everything you possibly can. And you, of course, you're interested in other children who haven't been born yet, but your obligation is to your children. Our obligation was to all children. All children who haven't been diagnosed, all children haven't been born yet. And so like Dan said, we were constantly had to ask, we have a broader mission. And what was interesting about this was that the team really held together until we had a drug that might actually work. And that's when the team, not the doctors, but the parents fractured at that point.
That's in the book. You guys
I
have to
just-
read the book. Yes, definitely. That's one of the. I mean, that was a kind of pivotal moment.
It was.
Yeah. I mean, I still think that we the people, we the scientists, the system needs to work for us. We need to be at the center. When I say we, I mean all of us in this room, because we're all patients, either now or someday soon, or someday later, hopefully. But I mean, we're all patients at some point, or we love people who are patients, or or there's patients in our family. So I do think that going about saying this is the way we've always done it. Well, that's actually not true. I mean, as I also say in the book, there wasn't even formal science as a profession. The name scientist was coined in 1833. It's not like, this has been since the dawn of time. And so, there is a scene in this book where Hugh Hempel, the dad of the twins, he goes to this big meeting where the FDA comes to try to broker, I think, a deal between the scientists and the parents. And he goes off to meet the regulator privately afterwards to see, wow, you seem to be hinting that we could do something innovative here. Is that true? And you could see on the regulator's face that he was struggling, that he wanted to do something innovative, that he really wanted to. And he wasn't allowed to, that's what I sensed that he wanted to. And then I felt like that was confirmed years later, because after he left the FDA, this regulator, he wrote a paper, which I cite in the book, along with a lot of other people, in which he made his opinions pretty firmly known, that he thinks the FDA needs to do more, and he thinks the NIH needs to do more, and he thinks that, that we need to be much more flexible or innovative in creating new systems. I mean, that's like, I don't argue in this book that there's one way of doing this. I argue that this is the way they chose based on the constraints that Dan and Chris so eloquently, laid out there. This is the way they chose to do it. They got pretty far, but they didn't get the drug yet over the finish line. They may still. This is what's so amazing, that this community has not given up on this drug. And when I say community, I mean the scientists as well as the parents. The company that ended up buying this drug and the company that initially started the trial got bought, and then it got bought again, and that company then dumped the drug after the early results of their trial didn't go the way they wanted. And you know what? In ordinary circumstances, that would be the end of things. Really, you would be done. But the community said, no way. Our data is good. We worked together to create a scale to measure whether the kids were benefiting. We gathered all this data. We went through all these trials together. We want our data taken seriously. And another company came in, and they bought the drug, and they're working with the community, and they're going to try to get that drug approved. Will they succeed? I have no idea. But what I'm saying is, I find it inspirational that so many times they could have quit. And so many times they could have just stopped. And some of them lost their children and still keep going to try to get this drug and other drugs approved because they believe in the model that we need to help each other as a community.
That was very well put. And I'm gonna just ask you one more thing, and then we'd like to open it up to all of you if you have questions. And that's this: you and Dan and Chris all talked about the fact that things have gotten a little more flexible. Did this partnership make a difference in that? I mean, 2014 is not that long ago. It's not, that last century. So in terms of the FDA, I cover the FDA a lot, so on the food safety stuff. The FDA is not an agency that moves with any great rapidity to change. Do you feel like this partnership, this unusual partnership, and we the scientists and parents, and even patients are working together, do you feel like it moved the needle? That if you were that you would see this as something that actually made a difference?
I think it made a difference. I mean, I think that there are other groups that got inspired by them, and I also think that there were other groups out there that were also, at the same time, doing similar things. I mean, you have, I mentioned that, Chris, when he set up this special robot lab, he got the blessing from his boss, who was Francis Collins, who's the former NIH director, and Francis worked with the mother of a child with a very rare disease when they were when they were looking for the genetic cause, and she co-authored a paper, with Francis. Like, so it's not that these were the only people out there doing this. They were inspired, by HIV activists, and and there were breast cancer activists, and there were mental health activists and disability activists. Nothing about us without us is, that you hear that. So I'm not going to say that they're the only ones out there, but they helped, in my opinion, they helped create a culture and an environment where it's just harder for the FDA to say no, because like any revolution, right? It's like, look at all the revolutions we see, the political revolutions, the dictators that you think are never gonna fall, the countries that are never gonna change. Enough people go in the streets, enough people show up knocking on doors and say, we need a different way of doing this, we're here, power to the people.
Yes.
Like, I think, I'm inspired, like, for all the ups and the downs and the fights and, and the tears, because there are tears. Whenever you get a group of human beings together that try to do something, there's gonna be tears. Because you have groups, their children are dying. How much more stressful can anything in life be than that? These poor, innocent children. And the scientists, like trying to navigate through, all this kind of bureaucracy on top of everything else. I mean, it's painful. It's really painful. But like, again, I don't blame anyone, because I think that we all operate in a system, and that the system needs to change in order to allow us to flourish and create these partnerships that will be even more effective, that will improve and build on what they built.
And do you hope the book will make a difference that way?
Well, I'm a journalist, of course. I wouldn't be in this if I didn't believe in it, I want to honor my mother's memory too. Like, when you're angry and you're sad, there's lots of things that you can do with all that anger and that sadness, but like, I write. That's what I do when I'm angry and sad. And so like, I saw these families and these scientists trying to do something, and I was moved, really, really moved and inspired. And by writing about them, I felt that I was honoring all the things I couldn't do for my mom, that I wanted to do for my mom. I wanted to write about it, so maybe some parent out there or some scientist out there will read this and say, let's try to build on what they did, and let's do this. Let's do this, like that, and that would make me so happy.
I like that answer too. So, do you guys have any questions? I'm a journalist, I have pages, but I really like to give you a chance. Yeah, over here, and I know there's a microphone somewhere, but if not, project, yeah.
So far we've talked a lot about the FDA and the families and scientists. One question I have is about the pharmaceutical companies and the economics of it. So when you have a rare disease that only has a few hundred people, how can you either lower the costs of drug production to make it economically viable, or find some way to make the economics work if the drug happens to be expensive?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, technically speaking, the FDA is not supposed to take into account prices when they're making these decisions, so it makes it even more challenging. Like, I think there needs to be innovation in how we do this, because you just read the newspaper to know that anytime a rare drug gets approved, they charge huge amount of money, right? So you're already seeing that some of the drug companies are trying to work with insurance companies to do payments in installments, like a mortgage on your house, a mortgage on a drug. I mean, the other thing that I think is upsetting is that I think that drug companies have the right, I work for the Wall Street Journal, right? So drug companies have the right to make money and they invest a lot. But think about how much money Chris Austin's Institute put into this project to de-risk it. And I can tell you that he put in millions and millions and millions of dollars, and that means we put in millions and millions of dollars because we fund the NIH with our taxes, okay? And then, there was also a drug company, Johnson & Johnson. They had been using cyclodextrin for one of their antifungal drugs, and they were kind enough to give their scientists, devote their scientists to work with the team. They didn't charge money for their labor. That was like a pro bono deal. And that was worth, if you put a price tag on that, I'm not even sure you can put a price tag on it. That's like a huge amount of money, right? And then Dan, who was at the time an academic investigator, he has to get his funding. He was writing grant application. I remember talking to him. He was writing grant application after grant application, so and then drug companies come in and they build on this investment. And so I think that we need to innovate this pricing system also, that if drug companies get a chunk of change from the public coffers, so that they don't have to spend that money themselves, then that should be factored in to the pricing, and if drugs seem like they're doing something, but the FDA isn't sure, I think that the FDA has to maybe give approvals, but be willing to take it off the market, So I think that there can be innovation on this too, but, it's a system. As we discussed, it's a system, and the high prices are part of the system.
Other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
From the economic point of view, everything is very expensive.
I'm gonna repeat the question, you guys. Keep going.
From the economic point of view, is it possible to take this information to another country and recruit patients, or perhaps influence a company to get started?
So the question is, would it be possible to do this on a more international scale? Take some look at patients in other countries, perhaps recruit drug or pharmaceutical companies from elsewhere to get involved? Are we being too US-centric in the way we're thinking about this?
Well, this clinical trial was not solely based in the United States, and that's because you don't have enough patients. So they did open up this particular trial, the cyclodextrin trial. They did recruit internationally. That's how they got, the patients. So, but the FDA tends to want, when they're making drug approvals, they tend to want data that's generated in the United States with US patients, because they work closely with other regulatory agencies, but you're gonna have to have some of the people be in the United States. But in this particular case, it was an international trial.
And do you see that also as a model for change, which I think is part of his point? If we do a larger embrace of these issues, if the FDA says, yes, let's make this a more international study, or do you think that's not workable?
that's the downstream end of this project, right? And I do think there's ways of lowering the cost of doing clinical trials. But to me, what I was focused on in this book is a kind of like an earlier stage, which is there a way of gathering data that would make it easier for the FDA to approve, that would make it easier to advance things? Is there a way that we can make the creation of scientific knowledge more accessible to greater numbers of people? So the pharmaceutical company is kind of at the end of this. We're talking about diseases that pharmaceutical companies aren't really looking at right away. So what this book is really an argument for trying to trying to recognize that there are different forms of expertise, and that people who live with a disease and who record meticulously what's happening when their children take certain drugs, people who immerse themselves in scientific literature so that they understand what the problems are, that they can help prioritize drugs that should move forward based on what the needs are. And look at the long COVID. I mean, let's bring it into the modern, the current with COVID-19. Look at the long COVID patients who they really have taken this model and even pushed it further themselves. I mean, there's the patient-led research collaborative, which was founded by long COVID patients. They convinced someone to give them the money, and they're using hypotheses that the patients who have the disease are coming up with, and they're funding research projects that are based on things that patients want done. And they created a scientific panel to weigh these projects, and the people on the panel have scientific training and background, but they also have lived with either long COVID or some other chronic illness for at least a year. So that, you have a disease like COVID, so many people get it, right? That there are people that are both scientists with like formal training in science and patients. And again, we need all that expertise. You can't do, in my opinion, you can't do science with one group, alone. You need all this kind of expertise. And I'm advocating for trying to create a system that will recognize that expertise and that will find effective ways to marshal it so that we can go faster and get more diseases treated.
Yes, over here.
A lot of the discussion tonight has been about the system, and I was wondering whether in your research for this book or in your years as a journalist delving into so many other related issues, are there any models outside the U.S. of systems that are working more effectively that could be emulated or modeled in some way?
That's a great question. And I wouldn't consider myself an authority on all things, but I'll tell you one thing that I think it makes it harder for us is that we don't have a single payer system. European countries have a single payer system, and therefore they're able to more easily gather data. Again, you can look at the COVID model. In the UK, they set up a whole system to test drugs by recruiting patients and putting them into different arms. And they were able to do that because they have centralized data collection, they have single payer, so again, boy, that would be a hard thing to change here, right? We're pretty committed to the way we do this with insurance companies and private, insurance. I think healthcare is a human right that we're all entitled to. So I'd like, but I do think that when, there are disadvantages to single payer systems, of course, and I'm not an authority on them, but one thing that there is an advantage is they're able to collect a lot of data, which makes it easier to draw conclusions and to test compounds and get actual output on it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
Maybe can you talk a bit about the sort of ethics of the kind of research that you're sort of, discussing in the book, and in particular in context of like how different is what these parents were doing at the very beginning of the work they started to say some of the things that we heard during COVID. Oh, try this drug, try that drug. Ivermectin comes to mind, but there were a bunch of sort of theories out there about we should try this and that and the other thing. that I think were largely treated with sort of a lot of at best skepticism in most circles. So what's the difference? Or where do you draw ethical lines around these parents and then some of the things we've heard more recently?
Could everyone hear that? So it's a bioethics question in which he's asking Amy, what are the sort of ethical issues that run through this particular inquiry? And also, if you look at something like COVID early on, where there were a lot of mystery compounds like ivermectin being put forward, sometimes by parents and patients, right? How do we actually deal with that sort of challenge in getting it right?
It's a really great question, Mike, and it's really complicated, obviously. I mean, in this particular, let's also take a step back and understand that these are children, so they can't consent to anything that's being done to them. Their parents are making decisions for them. And of course, parents make decisions for their children all the time. That's what parents do, right? So, but still, there is an ethical question that you gotta think about, that, you need to take a step back, that it's, that the person who's consenting is not the body that the thing is being done to. So it's always different when, you're willing to experiment with something on yourself versus having someone experiment on your child. So I do think that's an ethical question. But I think that there's an ethical question about, especially in rare diseases, where communities are very small and everybody knows each other. There's a scene, in the book, Dan is quoted in that scene, too, where, one of the parents decides that he would like to move forward with trying to, get the drug for his child outside a clinical trial, but he doesn't want harm to come to the other children, so that's an ethical question. I think there's so many ethical questions here, that it's hard to even choose one or the other. But the parents in this book, when they did compassionate use, that's not something that you just randomly do. The FDA gives you an approval. A doctor files, you don't just hey, FDA, can I give this drug to my child? No, your doctor does it. The Hempels, they used to take their kids every 6 months, to the hospital to see all the doctors, that gave them, that were their partners on the compassionate use, to do all these tests to make sure that the kids were not having some sort of, bad thing happen to them. So I don't want to give the impression, slightly different than the COVID thing, where people were sometimes, self-medicating in a way, which you're entitled to do that. I mean, you can do that if you want to. But I don't want you to think that the parents, I did an interview where someone said, the parents, when they went to the advisory hearing for the FDA and they were arguing that another drug had that they had taken, outside of a trial, had benefited their children. And, isn't that emotion? That's not science, that's emotion. And my sort of response was that the parents weren't saying to the FDA, approve this because we're sad. What they were saying is, we think that we've collected data that we find persuasive and that we'd like you to find persuasive. If you don't find it persuasive, then you have a responsibility to help us collect data in a more rigorous manner. So, I mean, that happened with the compassionate use as well. I think that the Hempels at a very early stage said to the scientists, what sort of, can we collect this data that we're gonna start collecting on our children? And again, the scientists weren't ready yet. It was very early in the process of trying to come up with a formal way of collecting the data. But in an ideal system, the FDA would say, we've come up with a way to collect this data, and we'd like you to collect the data in this way. And therefore, no matter who's collecting the data, whether it's your doctor through compassionate use or your doctor who's running a clinical trial, we're gonna have some data that we can at least make some comparisons to. Compassionate use is not controlled. Everyone knows that everyone's getting it. I mean, there's all kinds of problems. Dan and Chris talked to me for hours and hours on all the problems, and they're right. They're very smart people, and they're right. There's a lot of problems. But given that there's problems, how can we do it in a way that will at least enable the regulators to say, you know what? this is sufficient to meet the regulatory standard that allows us to confirm that the formal trial data seems good.
We're almost out of time, yes.
Sarah?
I want to ask about your process. I know you were recording this after many, many years, and I am wondering how you made yourself be done, and if you recording it, what's the withdrawal like?
So first of all, it's, well, my colleague Mark from the Wall Street Journal. Oh, and I see Brianna, my colleague from the Wall Street Journal. Hi. So I think they know me as, you know, they're my friends and also my colleagues, and they work with me. So they probably know that the editors at the Wall Street Journal would tell you that I never like to be done. I'm always the reporter who the editor's calling and saying, Amy, if you don't hit send, there isn't going to be no, I just want to tweak just one more thing. So I don't really like to be done. And I read the book recently after I had, you know, stepped away from it, and I already saw things I wish I could go back and rewrite it. So, but here's one thing that I kept in mind. One of the reasons why it kind of took a long time is one of my initial thoughts was, I don't want to finish this book until I know if cyclodextrin is going to be approved or not. Like, I had this vision in my mind that this was a story of a drug, you know, a trial, you know, being approved. Then all of a sudden I realized, my goodness, this drug is not approved yet. This could take years. This could take who knows how much longer. And I stepped back from it and I thought about the narrative and I said, is this really a story about a drug? Is it really a story about getting a drug approved? No, it's not. It's a story about a model. It's a story about a collaboration. It's a story about how can we do science in a different way. And once I kind of had that realization that that was my narrative, rather than what happens to this drug or another drug, it gave me permission to finish, you know, to bring it over the finish line. But if they gave me more time, I would keep going. I love rewriting.
Any last questions? If not, it's 8 o'clock. I know Amy would love to hang out and talk to you individually as well and sign books, and you've been fantastic.
Amazing.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.